Hello, and welcome to Spotlight On. My name is Ryan Duff, and with me today is Mexican-American award-winning journalist Alfredo Corchado. He is the author of Midnight in Mexico and his newly released book, Homelands, Four Friends, Two Countries, and the Fate of the Great Mexican-American Migration. Thanks for joining us, Mr. Corchado.
My pleasure, Ryan. Good to see you again.
Great. So I understand that about 3 years ago, you were here to talk about your book, Midnight in Mexico.
Right.
And it was about your investigations with regarding the cartel. Is that correct?
Yes.
So in the past 3 years, what has changed since you wrote that book?
In Mexico?
Yes, sir.
I think the situation is actually worse in Mexico when it comes to numbers, when it comes to more people killed. 2018 ended up breaking a new number. More than 32,000 people were killed throughout Mexico. And it's a story that, unfortunately, I think we haven't covered as much as we should, as deeply as we should. Part of the reason is we don't have as many journalists as we did, say, 3 years ago, 10 years ago. But that is still a very, very big issue. You have a president who came into office promising that he would restore security and that he would wipe out corruption. And I think that's really the reason why he was elected. He just completed 100 days in office. It's too early to judge how he's doing, where he's going. But I will tell you that factually the numbers continue to climb. So that remains a huge story for Mexico and for the United States.
Not too many people are out there brave enough like what you have done.
Well, there's a lot of journalists who I think are just as brave and just as courageous. I'm no more courageous than they are. But I think as a U.S. citizen, as a foreign correspondent, I think we have more of, I want to say more of a responsibility because we have more freedom to cover this. I want to believe that if something was to happen to me, there would be outrage, that people would pressure the Mexican government. That doesn't happen when a colleague in Mexico is killed. And this year alone, we've had 5, 6 journalists who've either been shot at and some killed. And that is a really, really poor example of a country that says it's in the top 20, the G20. Mexico needs to step up this game and needs to do a better job of protecting journalists.
I see. And I wanted to ask, what made you shift from, well, first of all, I wanted to ask you, will you ever create another book, like a sequel or an update on more investigations?
You sound like my agent. That's pressuring me. That's
okay.
No. That's a legitimate question. I mean, I think many readers have asked me, is there a sequel to Midnight in Mexico? And you never say never. But I kind of felt that as a Mexican-American journalist, as someone who was born in Mexico and raised in the United States, that I also wanted to write about my adopted homeland, the United States. So it's not really an issue of drug trafficking versus immigration. It's really about what I consider to be my homelands, which I feel that Mexico and the United States are my two nations. And I happen to live now between El Paso and Mexico City, which I call the epicenter of my homelands.
I see. So, about that, what made you shift from the cartel down in Mexico to immigration about your new book?
I always thought that if I was ever to write a second book, I wanted to take a closer look at what has become my country for more than 50 years now. The United States. And I felt that Midnight in Mexico was about the young kid, with the immigrant with all the nostalgia about the homeland, the motherland, who, against his own parents' wishes, goes back home and discovers, that in many ways it's a country that's being torn apart. That's you have, up to now, more than 200,000 people have been killed since 2006 in this drug war. So it's all, and without trying to sound too alarmist, but it's almost like the massacre of what is my motherland, Mexico. And I always thought if I had the opportunity, I would also write about El México de acá, the Mexico within the United States. But it's really, I see it as more as a universal story, the story of trying to find a place to belong. And Homelands begins with this question that I think has become even more poignant today, more of a sense of urgency. It's how do I fit in? How do I fit in into the United States? And it's told through the story of friendship. You know, four friends who meet on a wintry night in Philadelphia. They discover one another. They also discover tequila, which makes it easy to bring down the walls. And we start a conversation that's lasted over 30 years now. You know, how do we belong? Where do we belong in this country? How are we different from previous generations? Whether it's the Germans, whether it's the Irish, the Italians, Middle Easterns, Hungarians. I mean, how do we come in? And the bigger picture of Homelands is really looking at the contributions of Mexican migration over the last 100 years. You know, in my case, with my father, since the Bracero program, when more than 5 million contracts were awarded to Mexican workers to come to the United States and to help contribute to this country. You know, whether it's building places like some of the iconic buildings in Dallas or throughout the country. And it's an immigration that's slowly dwindling. It's falling. It's now at historic low numbers. So I thought it was a good moment to try to help maybe American readers understand that there was a lot of contributions that were made by people like my father.
I see. And in 1987, when you were in Philadelphia, it said that you felt out of place then. How do you think about it nowadays? How does that reflect on you today, thinking back?
I remember leaving El Paso in 1987, first week of January, and I was told it was going to be the coldest winter in Philadelphia, and here I am. I'm coming from El Paso. Mm-hmm. I think I bought a sweatshirt at the airport, thinking this will do. And I called several friends of mine and said, do you know of any Mexicans living in Philadelphia? And one of them said, there is one guy. His name is Primitivo Rodriguez, and you need to be nice to him because he may be the only Mexican, not just in Philly, but in the entire Northeast. And it was through Primo. So I went with this mindset that there aren't any more Mexicans. This is the only one. You got to take care of him. Looking back, that night I met two other Mexicans. One from Guadalajara, one who says he's more Mexican than all of us because he's from New Mexico. But we started this conversation. We started this friendship that it's lasted over 32 years. Looking back, I realized that there were Mexicans moving throughout the country. And this happened because in 1986 you had the Immigration Reform and Control Act. And that, I think, really it started is not the right word, but it really bolstered, it really underscored the movement of Mexicans throughout the United States. And you started seeing, at the Dallas Morning News, we did a whole series called the concept was the Mexicanization of the United States, but looking at places like Iowa, like Georgia, like South Carolina, the Southeast, and looking at how all of a sudden you had neighbors waking up in the morning saying, "Who are these people, and how did they get here, and what's happened?" Which is very much the debate that we're having today as this country.
Well, in your book, it said that approximately there were 700,000 Mexican immigrants since the 1970s, and I think of today there's over 35 million.
35 million Americans who trace their roots back to Mexico. So that's an incredible explosion, and they are slowly, some people would say maybe too slowly, becoming more and more active in American society, political leaders, or just basically participating in elections. So we're beginning to see, how the latest group of immigrants, which is really the story of America, is becoming more and more politically active in today's society.
Okay. Now, I have to ask, recently Congress had blocked Trump's emergency plan to build the wall. What are your thoughts about that?
Well, I think a lot of times people, when they think about the border, they think of a place like El Paso. They think it's a no man's land, that there are hordes of people coming in. I don't think Americans really understand that we already have a fence. I mean, we already have several physical barriers, and that a wall is not going to magically stop people from coming, because on some parts of the border, especially on the Texas border, you have the Rio Grande, and then you have a wall or you have a barrier. Mm-hmm. And it's interesting because back in 2006 when they started the construction, it was the activism community. You know, the activists in the community would say, "They're building a wall. They're building a muro." You know, and it was the authorities who would say, "This is not a wall. This is just a barrier to kind of control immigration." Which is, I have yet to hear one resident on the border say, "We don't want walls." I think people want some kind of barrier. People want security along the border. But you have this Rio Grande, and then you have the barrier. It's already U.S. soil. I mean, so you're already on U.S. soil. I'm not sure how a wall or a fence, whatever you want to call it, a steel bollard, is going to stop that. It's going to stop the massive, what we're looking at today, historic numbers of caravans coming in from Central America. That's not going to resolve the issue. I happen to come from one of the safest communities anywhere in the United States. I mean, El Paso, San Diego, Laredo, McAllen are some of the safest communities anywhere in the United States. Safer, I would say, than places like Chicago, places like New Orleans, places like Washington, D.C. So as a border resident, I think a lot of my neighbors feel like they are being scapegoated for political theater, if you will.
Political theater.
Political theater, yes.
I see. Now, because of ICE, them breaking up families, what are your thoughts about that as well, on top of the wall thing?
It's a very complicated issue. We saw the numbers really increase dramatically last year. I mean, there was a point where the numbers really declined. But just recently, we had the most historic number. We had 1,000 people come in one day. Central Americans in one day, and that's a story that's going to keep going. And I would just say, keep reading the Dallas Morning News and learn more about it.
All right. Well, thank you for joining us,
Thank you very
Mr.
much.
Corchado.
Great seeing you again.
Thank you for joining us today on Spotlight On. I'm Ryan Duff, and have a great day, Richland.